And welcome to today's meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. Seems like we're meeting weekly at the moment, but don't worry, we've not got a meeting next month. We have to wait until December the 7th for the next one after this one. But we're meeting this evening following a recommendation from a call-in session that was held on the 15th of September, and we'll be discussing the Council's asset management strategy this evening, which is due to be considered by Executive on Thursday this week. So just very quickly, we're all very familiar now with how these meetings work, but just for anybody who's watching at home, I've asked all the participants to keep themselves on mute throughout the meeting unless they're speaking. They'll indicate to me that they want to speak by raising the blue hand in Zoom, which is visible to me as the chair of the meeting, but not visible on the public broadcast. But I am bringing people in the order that they've indicated that they want to speak. If we're discussing a topic and somebody wants to make a comment on that particular item or has a supplementary question, I've asked them to just wave a physical hand, and if I can, I'll bring them in at that point. Just to remind all members on the meeting that these meetings are recorded and broadcast live on the webcast, but they're there for posterity on YouTube as well, so just bear that in mind when we're conducting the course of the meeting. All of the committee members are visible on the screen at the moment. We also have Janie Berry, who is the Director of Governance and the Council's Monitoring Officer, and we have Dawn Steele, who's the Head of Civic and Democratic Services, who will both be present throughout the meeting, although we have had one or two technical glitches today, so if their video feeds go off, it's just because we're trying to protect the bandwidth of the meeting this evening. There are not democracy officers, that's Dawn, but there's technical officers in the background as well, who you may hear coming over the feed if there is a technical issue, but hopefully we won't hear from them this evening. And there will be additional participants joining the virtual table when we reach the appropriate point of the agenda, and I'll be introducing those as they come to the table. If it looks as though we're going to be using the full 2 hours this evening, then I will look to take an adjournment at around about the halfway stage of the meeting, just to give everybody's eyes a rest. But if it looks like we're making good progress through the agenda, then I may well just press on through. So on to the main business. Apologies, I haven't received any apologies per se for this evening's meeting, but Councillor Rowley has let me know that he will need to leave early, so his video feed may go off, and that will be him having left the meeting. Likewise, Councillor Mason may also need to leave the meeting, and similarly, if you see his video feed go off, then that will be an indication that he's left the meeting. Otherwise, move us on to agenda item 1, which is the declarations of interest. So do any members have anything they wish to declare in respect to this evening's meeting? Councillor Kilbane.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Not a pecuniary interest, just we could well end up discussing 29 Castlegate, and my partner used to work there when it was the marvellous Youth Inquiry Service.
Thank you. Don't see anybody else indicating, and so I'll move us on to agenda item 2, which is public participation, but we don't have anybody registered for public participation this evening, so that was a very quick item. Before I move us on to the main agenda item, I just want members to note that in the supplementary papers that we've received for this evening's meeting, there are some pink or salmon papers which are confidential papers, and they're not to be discussed in the public meeting this evening. The supplementary agenda did allow for us to take a vote on excluding members of the press and public if we did want to discuss any of the aspects that are within those confidential papers. So if any members think that they might wish to discuss any of those, if you could just indicate to me now, and then we can see whether we need to take a vote on that. I'm not seeing anybody indicating at the moment, so I'll move us on. If we do reach a point where you think that you're wanting to raise something from those confidential papers, can I just be very clear with members that I need you to let me know as the chair that that's what you're intending to do, and then we'll need to take a vote on whether or not we go into a closed session to be able to discuss those items. It's really important that people don't just launch straight into discussing anything from those confidential papers. So if I move us on then to agenda item 3, which is the main item of business this evening, that's the update on the asset management strategy. And I could now invite the officers to join us at the table for this evening. So we're joined now by Neil Ferris, who is the Corporate Director of Economy and Place, and we have Tracy Carter, who is the Interim Director of Place, and we have Nick Collins, who is the Head of Asset Management. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the meeting, we're here to discuss the asset management strategy. The other element that the call-in meeting in September asked us to consider was the way in which decisions around disposal of assets is reached. And that is discussed within the supplementary report that you've received in paragraphs 11 to 13. So I just wanted to highlight that to you if any members had any questions about that. But otherwise, I believe Tracy's got a presentation that she can give us on the asset management strategy, and then members are welcome to ask questions. So over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just share my screen now, so give me a second. Okay, is that visible?
It's visible, yeah. We've got the same issue that we had when we were looking at it earlier, that we haven't got the full screen up.
Okay, I have to go back into Zoom. Won't be a second. Talk amongst yourselves. Where are we at now? Same thing?
The whole view hasn't changed. Ah, that's it. There you go.
I've got two screens and you have to swap between them, so apologies for the slight technical cack-handedness there.
No problem.
I'll go back to the beginning of the presentation now. Right, okay. So as you said, Chair, I'm Tracy Carter. I'm the Interim Director of Place, and I'm joined by my colleague, Nick Collins, who's the Head of Asset Management at the City of York Council. And we're going to take you through what is a fairly long and complicated report. So just to help kind of set that in some kind of context, the report contains an overview of the existing asset strategy for the council, and as part of that review, it makes a recommendation of an addition to the articulation of the aspirations around sustainability, particularly to strengthen the wording around our aim of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. The report, as the Chair pointed out, also then explains the Council's process for reviewing asset decisions and how it arrives at those recommendations. And then there is an update on the operational estate, the commercial portfolio, our processes around community assets, and then the assets that we have that are used for housing delivery. And it describes some of the work that's been going on during the last year or so on each of those portfolios, and then recommends a series of business cases and proposals either for lease, disposal or acquisition, which are designed to deliver further strategic benefits to the council, and the whole package in its entirety delivers capital receipts of somewhere in the region of about 5.9 million. It makes a request for further capital investment into one of our commercial opportunities of 3.9 million, but also outlines how the resulting decisions grouped together will give a positive gross revenue income of £490,000 per annum to the general fund. And just to point out that this report is here before you ahead of any decisions being made as part of our commitment to pre-decision scrutiny. So the comments of the committee will be taken forward and presented to executive on Thursday. And we've done the report in this way, partly as a result of the previous call-in committee discussion, but partly because as over the years when we've taken individual asset decisions through to executive, it has tended to kick off a bigger decision about the role that they play in a broader based strategy. And what we've tried to do here is to pull together the comprehensive picture of all of those different objectives in play, so you can see how some of them end up leaning more towards a community benefit, Others are very, very strongly focused on having a financial benefit, and others are trying to keep those two in balance. So it is a fairly long and complicated report, but we're going to start by asking Nick to present to you on the performance of the commercial portfolio.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and good evening, everybody. As Tracy mentioned, I'm Nick Collins, and I'm Head of Asset Management. And I thought I'd kick off with some graphs, actually, just to give you a flavour of the commercial portfolio and how it's doing. So you'll see in the report that we've actually got over 1,000 assets and actually about over 1,100 occupational agreements, so a considerable number indeed. And again, in the report, it states that we take an income of circa £6 million a year from our property assets. Now, the donut graph on the left-hand side that you'll see, the coloured one there, actually shows the number of assets that we've got in terms of what I class them as main income earners. Now, we've got roughly about 330 to 340 what I call main income earners, which provide the lion's share of that property portfolio income. And what we've done there is actually split the assets up by asset type to give you that flavour. So you'll see there the orange segment of the donut is the retail. The red section is commercial leisure. So we mean things like moorings, the race course, for example. You see the blue segment's the offices. Green is industrial. The little yellow one is agriculture. And the purple one is a category we couldn't quite think of a name for. So that's anything else, miscellaneous. So telecom masts, nurseries, all sorts there. So you'll see actually there, which is synonymous with York's economy, of course, that we've got a rather large retail segment there. And the interesting point to get across to you actually is in terms of the overall percentage of income of that £6 million, if you tot up the total orange and red segments there, that's the retail and commercial leisure, roughly, if you combine those two, that would provide about half of our portfolio income. So, you know, given where we are with COVID, there are obviously some risks there, which I'll talk a little bit later on. So that gives you a flavour of the asset breakdown. The graph on your right-hand side is how we've done in terms of property income over the years. And as you'll see there, 2020, the light blue bar, we were up at around about £6 million a year. That has grown steadily over those years. We have been proactive as a local authority in purchasing assets such as Swinegate, Hospital Fields Road. We bought Holland and Barrett last year over on Coney Street. So if we go on to the next slide, Tracy. So I mentioned earlier, obviously the portfolio and COVID-19. Really, really difficult times, needless to say. But here at the council, obviously, with members backing, working all together, it's been a really, really proactive and swift approach to do what we can to help business tenants. If you cast your memories back to March, when this all started off, that actually coincided towards the end of the month there in March with the rent quarter day, which is issued there. So we moved incredibly quickly to cease those rent quarter demands going out to really help business tenants' cash flow. As the unfortunate situation continued into the summer, obviously the next quarter was due in July. And so again, with members, we took the decision to again defer payments where we felt it was appropriate to do so, very much working on an individual basis, contacting all of the tenants to see how we could help, how they were getting on, etc. And obviously very, very difficult times indeed. What I can report though, in terms of that 2-quarter period, the majority of the rental load for that period has now been paid or is now subject to payment plans. Again, what we've stated to our business tenants is that we are here to defer the rents out for a period of up to 24 months. Obviously, the income we get from the rents pays for the council services, but at the same time, you know, it's essential to help our business tenants. So that's where we were or are indeed on the payment plans and the rental income for that period. Positive sign for the portfolio. Historically, we've had very low levels of vacancies across the board, and I'm pleased to advise that that continues even today. Indeed, in the retail and hospitality sector, we have got a few vacancies, but they are properties which are under offer, I'm pleased to say. So that's really, really positive. And the approach we've taken here is to really try and maintain that high occupancy rate for the portfolio. And the last point goes without saying, huge amount of work's gone on, but a huge amount of work is still to be done. There's a heck of a lot of ongoing work to be done, looking after our business tenants, working with them, looking at the individual circumstances, and clearly the situation is going to be very much dependent upon the national picture. Lockdowns, positive signs, hopefully, with a vaccine on the horizon, but we'll have to wait and see. So that is basically where we are. If we move to the next one.
So we then come into a whole series of different recommendations that are contained within the report, each of which has its accompanying paragraphs in the report and a recommendation, starting with the Guildhall. So the Guildhall is still under construction, due to be finished summer next year. And the business case for that was signed off by executive on the basis of there being two income sources going in there, one for the office element of the scheme, and one for a let of a restaurant unit onto the river frontage. And the business case assumed on the office front that it would generate a certain amount of income and have a kind of fighting fund for repairs and maintenance. Now we have now secured a lease of that office element of it with the university via York Science Park Limited, which is a company owned by the university and the council jointly, with the council as very much the junior shareholder in that, with just over 9% of the shares. So if the university are to lease that building, it means that they will then run it as part of their kind of city centre presence and run that for small business growth space to support the high-tech businesses coming out of the university. So we see that as them as a really ideal partner for running that scheme in the city centre. And the terms and conditions of the deal that has been negotiated meet all of the financial expectations set out in the council's business plan. So we see that as being a great element of kind of risk management within the Guildhall scheme, because it secures over 50% of the projected income for the scheme at a time ahead of the scheme actually being completed. Now, clearly, the restaurant unit, it is not a great time for the hospitality industry because of all those COVID factors that Nick's just referred to. But we hadn't anticipated undertaking soft market testing this year. We will pause that activity because there's very little point in actually soft market testing at this point until we move into next year, see how COVID plays out and see how the market recovers. We still anticipate that being a very, very marketable space when the restaurant industry recovers from COVID, which it will. It is likely to be one of the best locations for a restaurant in the city. So I think in the fullness of time, we see that will pick up. But ahead of being out of construction, we've now secured a large part of the income, which is a very, very positive position. We've also entered into further discussions with the university about our shares in York Science Park, which are historic. The company was set up when we were still a district council, and I think they were transferred into CYC in 1996. And we, as a very junior shareholder within that, we don't have any control over board decisions, and the university perform the function of supporting businesses through that business line extremely effectively. And we see our interest in that company now as not delivering a great strategic benefit, though those strategic benefits are already being accrued. So we have been approached by the university as to whether or not we would agree to dispose of our shares in York Science Park for a capital sum, which is contained on the pink papers. Second point is the acquisition of the head lease for the Eco Centre up at Clifton Moor. We own the freehold. We operate the centre under a lease back to the developers, and have now, having taken that back into council operation about 3 years ago, have started to turn that from being a loss-making effort into a very small profit. However, if we buy back the head lease and own the whole units lock, stock and barrel, then even after we've paid back the cost of our borrowing, we will be making a profit of somewhere in the region of £59,000 per year. So this will increase the efficiency of the commercial portfolio, and importantly, it will also secure the future of the 67, 68 companies who are operating out of the eco centre at the moment. The third recommendation will be for the sale of 3 different council assets. I'll start at the end and work backwards. There are 2 individual dwellings, one at 103 Heslington Road, one at 159 Mount View, which are actually part of the Strays, and they were formerly herdsmen's cottages where the person responsible for maintaining the strays would have lived. They have been vacant and for some time now, and we have not found an internal council use for those properties. They're not particularly useful for service usage, and given their locations and their places on the Stray, we recommend a disposal of those for best value, and that will require us to post a section 123 notice to be able to dispose of them, given their location on the Strays, which is public open space. So it's a slightly complicated process to get to disposal. The third of those assets, sorry, there's also land at Lincroft Lane, which is, Nick, do you want to take over here while I just have a slight drink of tea?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tracy. Yes, land at Lincroft Lane. This one is located to the south of the city, actually. It's part of a former agriculture holding, some of which was sold off many years ago, actually. The whole holding is about 10 acres in total. Now, within that 10 acreage, there are some rather derelict barns adjacent to Lincroft Lane itself, which links off to the A19 Fulford Road, and that comprises of roughly about 1.2 acres in total. And what we're recommending is that we actually dispose of the footprint of where those barns are, together with a small area of land which would form potential gardens, and look to sell for the basis of a potential residential conversion. The rump of the land, the remaining 8 or so acres, would indeed be retained as the report stipulates.
I'm going to move on now to the sale of Oakhaven and the look at the viability study on Morell House, which were both former older persons accommodation buildings, which have been vacant for some years now. As part of the older persons accommodation programme, we have re-provided 360 beds in New Lodge, Ouseview, Handley House, Burnholme, with extra care being re-provided in Glen Lodge, Marjorie Waite Court, Arden House and Barleyfields and Ashbank, with a future redevelopment of a care home on Lowfield. That programme is kind of coming towards its end now, and we are now left with those assets that were freed up by that programme being subject to consideration for their alternative uses. Having looked at Oakhaven for on a number of occasions, there's quite a history to this one. The procurement of a care provider for extra care apartments on that site, looked at developing the site, but after engagement with planning, the massing and size of building on that site was not big enough to justify the investment from that procurement. They pulled out. We've had further discussions with the market, and they don't think that that site is big enough for that kind of provision. So we have then subsequently been approached by the providers of nursing care, which is a slightly different footprint and can fit onto a smaller plot. But we have been approached for a very attractive capital value on that site, given the position we're at in the kind of COVID market. So we can secure a kind of pre-COVID price on that site with a fairly quick turnaround. Nick, I don't know if you want to talk about the provisions we would have for backstop on that site.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we've been approached, as Tracy's mentioned, by a company in this field. They've got 31 other care homes in the Yorkshire and North East region, and they've offered a deal which we consider is representative of market value. Now, as owner of the property, it's all very well listening to a company saying we'd like to make you an offer, but they need to actually make us an offer and do something. So we've laid down the gauntlet to them, and they assure us that they are ready to go in terms of submitting a pre-application in immediately. And so how we can actually tie this arrangement up is to actually say that yes, we'd be prepared to actually sell this, but to actually demonstrate that you're going to do something, we will give them a strict period of time, as we set out in the report, to actually go about and obtain planning and spend some money at risk. And we've said in the report a period of 12 weeks to crack on and enter into the deed. And it's called basically a long stop date. So you enter into an agreement for sale, and if the company don't meet that long stop date by doing certain actions, then effectively you can terminate, guillotine that agreement, and that's what we do, and go off to the market if they don't actually crack on, as it were. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. And then we move on then to the second of the old persons homes that have been empty for some time, which is Morell House, which is towards the end of Burtonstone Lane. And that house, it's a relatively small footprint, and not particularly densely built up around it. In terms of its suitability for other council uses, we have not found anything. In terms of its suitability as part of our housing delivery programme, it is a very small site, and is not judged to be the most efficient way of expending the kind of housing delivery capital budget. So just to kind of come back to the housing delivery programme, just to remind you, it's targeted with delivering over 600 homes and has a budget of about £150 million. And the mix of tenures on the site is predicated on 40% affordable, so that's 20% social housing, and the remainder of other tenures of affordable housing, including shared ownership. The other 60% is targeted for private sale, and it's the profit from that 60% that funds the increased level of affordable housing and creates the most benefit from the capital investment from the HRA. The HRA is at the moment leveraged as hard as we would regard to be prudent. So in delivering the £150 million budget, our friends in finance would be, I think, slightly worried if we were to be increasing that in size at the moment, and nor do we have the capacity to build out on a number, dozens of sites at the same time. So we're very much focusing our capital where it can deliver the most benefit. So the recommendation on Morell House is that we move to dispose of that site, but we do want to try and undertake a review of whether or not it can usefully form part of our self-build programme. So that would be putting in the infrastructure to enable it to service a number of plots, which would then be sold to individuals to build their own houses on. It's quite a commitment as part of the housing delivery programme that we support that kind of build, but we haven't had time yet to do a full business case. So we will undertake that review and then bring back for a future decision. I talked about the HRA housing delivery programme already, but there are then two further recommendations as part of this report to take forward for new sites as part of that programme. The first of which is another old person's accommodation site that has been empty for some time, Willow House. That's just off Warmgate, inside the city walls. That has been the subject of a decision to dispose, and that had eventually came to nothing when, through further discussions with planning, the size and massing of development that the developer wanted to build on that was not possible. So what we're recommending here is for us to release 120,000 from our £1,000 from our HRA Housing Delivery Programme Development Fund to be able to put together the design, review the adjacent estate, undertake public engagement, and be able to develop the outline business case for a housing delivery programme development on that site, where it sits amongst a lot of other housing assets. A similar principle with York Central, where we have a relatively small 5% land holding on the whole of York Central, and that is the Firmatol industrial estate just off Lehman Road, and a sliver of land where there is currently a car park. What we want to do on this one is to use £150,000 from the CYC York Central budget to be able to review our land holdings, look at a spatial design for how that might be developed as part of our housing delivery programme to try and kick off the first phase of residential on York Central with 40% of affordable housing on our land. That may involve the acquisition of land from Homes England Network Rail to make that site sit better within the overall design of the scheme. And as you can hear, my voice is now going. Nick, do you think you could take over on the next slide?
Of course, absolutely. So onwards, 29 Castlegate is the next one on our list. This one has got two accesses in terms of the property. It's accessed to the side of Phoenix from the Coppergate Centre, and indeed from Castlegate itself. The property is an interesting layout. It's laid out effectively to a cafe at ground floor level, with some cellular offices also at ground floor level. There's a communal access in from the Castlegate access. You've got a stairwell going up to the first floor, where again you've got more cellular offices, and then up to the top floor, where you've got some rather low floor to ceiling office space. Should also say there's a rather chunky basement as well, which would lend itself nicely to a cafe use. So we've taken advice from local agents, looked at potentially values in terms of what we might get in terms of letting it for, as it's laid out, a cafe type use, and indeed small business unit offices. And it's felt that the income should be derived around about £45,000 a year. So as you see there on the slide, we're talking about a capital budget of £270,000 to undertake maintenance repairs to the property. It's been empty for a long while. As the report sets out, it was going to be disposed of to the Conservation Trust, but they've kind of pushed away from that. And again, the last point on that particular line is the kind of equation, really. So it's how much profit will we get after we pay back the borrowing costs? So the kind of gross cost is £45,000, and then you net off the actual costs of borrowing effectively, repaying the capital cost which is there, which gives a net profit of £27,000 per annum. I should say those particular uses I talked about will need planning consent, so that's a route that we'll be recommending to go down. Thanks,
Nick. The next one is an extension of a decision that's already been made by executive, which is for when the Haxby Hall transfers to a new provider to purchase the ambulance station to facilitate improved layout of the scheme. That was time limited in the previous executive decision, and this just simply requests an extension of that for a further 7 years from the transfer of Haxby Hall, because the ambulance service are not in a position at the moment to be able to review the location of their peripheral sites. I believe that COVID has had a fairly big impact on them as well. And the next one is, it's really an update on the location of a decision that's already been made, which was the decision taken to purchase 155 acres of arable land to turn into a new woodland for the city, and we can now reveal the location of that as being to the west of Knapton, on the outer edge of the outer ring road between Knapton and Ruffus. And having walked around it the other day, it's really, really very big, and it's quite a kind of an exciting project to think that we might be creating one of the largest new woodlands in the country. In the report, we also talk about reviewing the council's operational estate, its occupational estate, being now having rationalised down into Hazel Court and West offices nearly 10 years ago now, which just makes me feel quite old, because that was also one of my projects. It is time now to review our usage and consider whether or not that continues to service us in the same way. During the time since we moved in, the balance of the space taken up by CYC and the balance taken up by partners has changed quite significantly. And we currently let out about a third of the building to partners, including Public Health England, the CCG, Network Rail, and a range of other smaller occupants. And obviously COVID has also had a fairly significant impact on office usage, not just during the pandemic. I think it's been one of those step changes that moves us into a very different model of flexible working. So what we're undertaking to do here is to review both the West offices and Hazel Court to see if they are they still laid out in the same way, is a space allocation at what we need it to be for the next 10 years. And on Hazel Court, that also includes consideration of the electrification of the council's fleet. So when we are operating with more electric vehicles, how are we best going to use our resources to be able to charge those? And there are potential for us to look at the Harewood Wyn, former tip site, to see whether or not that can be used to generate green energy to be able to charge those electric vehicles. So all of that will be reviewed as soon as we can see a way through and understand the longer term impacts of COVID and what that might have, what that might mean for our estate. And like every other large organisation in Britain, it is the time to review that and make sure that it's still fit for purpose. The next one is for us to, we will be bringing further decision back to executive about this, but it's to alert members to the status of a piece of land on the riverbank adjacent to Scarborough Bridge, which was originally leased by the council 100 years ago, well 98 years ago, from the railway companies at the time, and is where we have a riverside pedestrian and cycle path at the moment. That lease is due to expire in 2023, and we need to make a decision as to whether or not we extend the lease or try and purchase the freehold of that land so that we can maintain the route of that really important pedestrian and cycle connection. At the moment, we're assessing our liabilities under the lease, which requires going underwater, going into the river to assess the status of the riverbank. And we've been slightly put off by COVID and by high river levels on a number of occasions now, but we hope to be able to bring that back in the autumn. And then finally, just to note the performance of the commercial portfolio, as Nick set out in his presentation. And I think just there's a lot of information in there, but just to kind of summarise and remind members of the core of the financial elements of our asset management strategy. Our whole capital programme and our ability to invest in new properties is predicated and dependent on us actually generating some capital receipts, and our strategy assumes that our portfolio is fluid, that we do make acquisitions and therefore we also make disposals, and that we do that investment and divestment decisions wisely based on drivers that come to the fore over time. And that is always going to be fluid. So when I've outlined in the report the process by which we arrive at those, it is very difficult to go, you do A and then you do B and then you do C, because it very much depends on opportunities in the market. It can depend on the status of the council's finances. It can depend on a number of different drivers which will shape those decisions as you go forwards. But what we've tried to set out for you in that whole range of things is, this is a dynamic part of the council's asset base. It's a dynamic part of how we fund the council, and that we are constantly looking at new opportunities. We're constantly reviewing uses. It's not something that you ever get right once and then just leave. It is always going to be a kind of evolutionary and dynamic process. So I'm going to end the slideshow right there and stop showing my screens, and then invite questions from the committee.
Thank you very much to both of you for a thoroughly comprehensive report there. I think you know, that was very detailed and lots and lots of information there. I think what I'd like to do, I will very much invite members' questions, but I think because of the nature of the sort of the various different elements in it, what I'd like to try and do is just split it up into sort of sections, as it were. So I think just so that we don't lose sight of the sort of the smaller part of the recommendation in a way from the call-in, which was just around the process by which decisions are reached to dispose of individual assets. I had one question on that particular topic, and I'd just like to invite if members have anything particular on that. Then what I'd like to look at is perhaps the principles and objectives, the sort of overarching kind of parts of the strategy, and then I guess there'll be questions on individual aspects of the strategy and you know, possibly particular individual cases within it. So just thinking about the sort of overall decision-making process, and you know, I appreciate the comments that you made there, Tracy. I think what I'd like to just understand a little bit more about is my sense is that there's a set of principles. The corporate management team makes some decisions around how those principles are enacted through the assets that we have and what the market's looking like, and then makes a recommendation to whether it's an exec member for a decision session or a recommendation to executive. And so I suppose from a ward councillor perspective, I'm not quite clear, other than perhaps via the executive decision session, where the input might come if there's a bit of local knowledge about a particular asset, or if there's ideas about possibly alternative uses than straightforward disposal or leasing to a new business or what have you. So I wonder if you could just give us a sense of how a ward councillor, just as a backbench councillor, can have an input into a decision session, a decision-making process around how an asset might be used or better used going forward.
So if we, it does kind of depend on the nature of the decision that we are proposing. We will involve ward councillors when we think that there is a kind of complex set of community arrangements to be able to understand and unpick before a recommendation is made. If we're recommending a financial disposal because the council needs to generate a capital receipt, then that conversation may be less detailed, but we do try and engage ward councillors before making recommendations, so it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody.
Okay, thank you. I guess, sorry, Neil, I saw your hand go up as well. I'll bring you in a sec. I guess what I was just wanting to get at is almost if a decision is to dispose and there's other ideas within a community for how a building could be used, how does the community feed that information through? And I would expect the ward councillor to perhaps be coming to you and saying, actually, we hear that, you know, this might be being disposed of, we'd like to offer some alternative uses. But it's almost by the time you hear that an asset might be disposed of, sometimes it feels as though the decision-making process may have gone further down the line than you might be able to make an input on. And it's almost at that very earliest stage when you're looking at assets that you have that disposal may be one option, but you know, community use may be a different one, where it's not always straightforward. It's just trying to think about how the community can get involved at that earliest stage. Neil, I don't know if you wanted to just add anything or comment on that.
Just to add in terms of the role of members in deciding with our assets, and more broadly what we do with the sort of spatial distribution of assets across the city. So just wanted to highlight, obviously there's the local planning permissions, executive decisions, there's the budget process, there's full council policy objectives such as the carbon objective, which is seen as purchase the land for the trees. And then specifically when you look at individual properties, there are issues where community assets are looking at becoming out of use and potentially, as you say, subject to alternative uses. So 68 Centre, the consultation happening on there. And the other piece I would ask for all ward councillors is, if you've got community needs, bring them to through your ward committees and through through officers as to the needs that you've got. We tend to go with, here's an asset, what can we dream up a use for? If you've got a need for a community asset, start that process now rather than it being a building-led approach. Let's work on the basis of ward councillors. What is it that your communities need? And then we can start to address that as an officer core and with the executive. So just a few points there.
Thank you. Now, Councillor Kilbane, your hand went up before. I said that I wanted to just sort of split things up into three ways. So if it was a question on this particular element, I'll bring you in. Yeah, Councillor Kilbane.
It's actually a supplementary for Neil, really. It's just a point of information in the way that these things, actually work. So if you take something like the Herdsman's Cottage on the Mount, we've no idea it's up for sale. As far as we're concerned, someone lives there and suddenly it's up for sale, and you think, oh, that'd make a great youth club, but it's too late, because the conversation moved on. But anyway, the question, well, first of all, congratulations on having a much lower rate of voids in the city centre than commercial landlords. That must take some doing. So congrats on that. I'm sure you'll be able to share the secrets of your success with the committee. So well done on that. My question is related to the previous question. So looking at paragraphs 11 to 13 about assessing the future of council assets, I'm wondering how much policy has to say on how you process that. So clearly the whole procedure's been rewritten because of the carbon neutral targets, but let's say, for example, a council was elected that said we've got a terrible lack of affordable, really truly affordable housing, not 80% of market rate, but actually affordable housing, and so we're going to use all our land to build council houses. What impact how would that change the policies that you've got there? Because they seem to be largely just sort of financial considerations, really.
Well, the policy drives as to what you do with an asset set out in the report, and they have to be balanced with the financial realities of whether those ambitions can be achieved either within the general fund or the housing revenue account. And what we're trying to do here is to be able to service those community needs, the policy ambitions, but within a business case that is actually viable. So we can all dream up 10 things to do with every asset, but not many of them are often viable. And that's the key point of what we've got here. But in the context of trying to achieve those ambitions, what we've got in here is how those ambitions are being met through broader programs, and then how we need to meet the financial implications of those decisions through a range of other decisions. So there is a complex interplay between individual decisions, and you can't always have a community benefit from every single asset when you've got a financial business case to be able to feed. You have to be able to feed the acquisition and development through realizing some of the financial value of some of your assets. That's just a reality of the economics that surrounds it.
Councillor Kilbane, I'll bring you back on your supplementary, and then Neil, I see that you're wanting to add something as well. So
I guess it's that what I'm interested in is that sort of tension between policy and the principles as set out here, really. And I'm just curious as to why sort of policy is not more reflected in that decision-making process. It seems to be floating around in the ether somewhere, and it's because it seems to me that actually the considerations of the department trump the political considerations. Would that be a fair assessment?
No, I think if I've expressed it that way in the report, then that is wrong. I mean, the thinking that drives my teams when they are evaluating and defining those options is very much to be able to deliver on the policy ambitions that are set out within the strategy. So the need for affordable housing is in there, the need for community space is in there, but it is underwritten by the need for a robust business case that's going to make that all work.
Neil, did you want to add something there as well?
Just to reassure Pete, really, members decide policy for the council. So it was a new council came into being and said, actually, we don't need to make £6 million a year out of our property portfolio. We can effectively raise that through taxation or other means of revenue. And that you want to sell land or use land for housing, that would entirely be a matter for that new incoming membership to decide. And that would then, as Tracy's rightly pointed out, would then influence officers' decision making. So this policy that we have in front of you and the balance that is struck between revenue and social outcomes is one that has been determined by members. I would reflect that the revenue is all council services, be that social services, people-based services, place-based services. It's not that that revenue is effectively goes into some sort of profit or dividend. It's all spent on the people of York, and it's that balance that obviously consider when they make their choices.
Thanks, Neil. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the the changes that have been made to better reflect the council's ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030. I can see how some of that is coming through in the refresh of the strategy, but in terms of going forward, you mentioned that the strategy is a living thing and it does react. I really just wanted a sense of next steps, really, in terms of how you think the beefed up strategy in relation to sustainability will feed through and underpin sort of future decisions going forward. Because obviously amending the wording is one thing, but sort of delivery is another. So it'd be useful to get your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, the words are a bit of a catch-up in a way, aren't they? They're just to reflect the changes that that are happening with our kind of policy framework and our thinking, and to make sure that our strategy reflects the other ones that the councils sign up to. And you'll pick out from within the proposals that there are sustainability proposals set out within there. So there's the investment in the eco centre to put photovoltaics on the roof to be able to generate green electricity there. That's already a fairly eco-friendly building. This is just adding on more. There's a consideration of a big PV array on Harewood Wyn. There's the purchase of the woodland. There's the use of water sourced heat pumps at the Guildhall. And we continue to explore grant funding opportunities to green our commercial estate and our operational estate to be able to contribute towards those targets. So we want to make sure that when we're evaluating each of the opportunities within this, that is a consideration that we make. It's not just a nice to have, but there's a presumption that we, in our investments, we try and do something about this as well.
Thanks, Tracy. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. So this is quite interesting. It's the asset management strategy from 2017 to 2022. So we're, I guess, a year away from, or maybe even nearly there in terms of completing it. And there's obviously a new strategy presumably getting drawn up soon.
I think this is the new strategy. It was a review of the existing one and an extension of time with those amendments. So if there are other things that you want to see in the asset strategy, now is the time to shout.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kilbane.
Thanks, Chair. I'm always happy to wait if anybody else has got a burning question. So
I'm just keeping us on this particular topic area at the minute, and then I'm going to move us to look on the other ones.
Just in terms of the strategy, then, in terms of the decision-making process, how heavily is it influenced by the cost of borrowing? So, if are the needs for capital receipts for further investment as high if borrowing's really cheap? Do you weigh up whether or not it makes more sense to retain a portfolio while borrowing's cheap and then maybe selling them when borrowing's more expensive?
I mean, the overall treasury management strategy does influence it. borrowing is cheap at the moment, and hence our investments in certain assets, but it doesn't necessarily drive us to retain an asset just for the sake of it if we have no demonstrable need for it and we cannot see a future business case for it. So I mean, a lot of the ones that we are proposing for disposal here, our consideration of whether or not the business case is good does take the longer term financial picture into account. So we need to be securing a good capital value, and we would not recommend selling at the bottom, at the bottom of the market just to generate a bit of cash. The ones here are genuinely assets for where we do not think there is a long-term better picture, and that the advantages of disposing now are demonstrable.
Neil, did you want to add something to that?
Just in terms of the question of borrowing and revenue return, the authorities absolutely, the finance guidance coming through to your finance officers, and your finance officers' approach to this is that we do not invest purely for a commercial return. So if you look at, for example, the purchase of Swinegate, which I know some have felt was purely for commercial terms, the reason we've got such a high occupancy level is that those properties were specifically identified as being smaller units, opportunities for local retailers to occupy those units, and the business premises above them. So it's effectively from the officer and the members at the time who took the decision to invest in Swinegate was seen as part of becoming a socially responsible landlord in the city centre. And obviously, I think that that's manifested itself in COVID in the terms that we've offered those residents throughout COVID. So just to repeat your perspective on this, it's not a commercial exercise. We've got to have social outcomes, be that regeneration, housing, or environmental, that we're looking at alongside the economic returns.
And it's the overall risk portfolio that you're taking on as well. And in the news, we've heard reports of Croydon in particular of having invested very heavily in retail that has then they've not necessarily invested at the right time or in the right way, and it's ended up being a massive risk for the authority. Now we would always be more circumspect about the extent to which this particular aspect of the council's business exposes the council as a whole to risk, and therefore that's got to be balanced alongside the rest of our kind of financial picture, as well as the requirement for us to also have the powers to be able to undertake this, not just for profit.
Councillor Kilbane, I think you were indicating you had a supplementary, and then Nick, I've just seen you as well, so I'll bring you in. Did you want to, in fact, Nick, did you want to add something to what Tracy was saying, and then I'll ask Councillor Kilbane.
Absolutely, yes, thank you, Councillor. I was just going to say, actually, many local authorities have actually invested outside of their boundaries. Now, in York, we haven't. We've always said that we're investing in our city, and that does seem to have paid dividends in COVID by supporting our local economy. But you see other local authorities up and down the land who invested in other towns and cities hundreds of miles from where they are. So, I think that's really proof in the pudding as to what we've actually invested in.
Thank you. Councillor Kilbane.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for these answers. It's really interesting. So in terms of the business case for a property and asset that we own that we're trying to weigh up whether or not to dispose of, how do you weigh up the business case versus the social case? There may be no business case for keeping it. Well, let's take the Herdsman's Hut, for example. There may be no business case for maintaining it, but there might be a social case for running it as a youth club, for example. How do you, because I'm not seeing it in this process as to how they're weighed in the balance, as it were.
Well, we tend to look at what other assets that we have in the area. Are there other community facilities around? Is it an area where there's an expressed need for a new community facility? So taking the Herdsman's Huts as examples, it's just around the corner from the Panthers, what's it called? The sports pavilion just round the corner. So it's within spitting distance of another community facility, which the council has put quite a lot of capital into over the last 5 years. So it would be unlikely we'd identify that as being a kind of target area for further investment in community assets, given the proximity it has to another very similar facility. we do depend upon our services to be able to articulate their needs, and that's why the CMT process is key to that, of identifying alternative uses, or where there may be an ambition that has not been realised by any of the rest of our assets.
Yeah.
Neil, if you wanted to add something.
I think that just reinforces the point that I was making earlier, that all ward councillors need to look at their communities and understand what assets, what needs they need. So rather than looking at it from a buildings pace perspective, what is it that your community needs, and can you articulate a case for that facility? And then over time, there's ebbs and flows in terms of the control on the authority, there's ebbs and flows in the availability of capital, then officers can work within the policy framework to achieve those objectives that ward councillors set us. But the starting point is, what does the community want, rather than what buildings we've got.
Well, I thank you for that, and I shall just lay down a marker now that we desperately need somewhere for young people in Micklegate Ward to actually be able to hang out, because I appreciate the point you're making, Tracy, around Hamilton Panthers, but actually that facility is a very different facility than a youth service or youth club might be. So please take that as a plea from me as the ward councillor for Micklegate Ward. Desperately need it. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was going to ask a question for Tracy, I think, in terms of what the importance of a really sound asset strategy means when we take into account the impacts of COVID, both the short term and long term. And I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but I also wanted to ask about the carbon neutrality policy and how that's been embedded in the asset management strategy.
Councillor Pearson, if I can just ask you to hold that thought just 1 second, because I think that's more onto the next bit about the objectives and the kind of principles of the strategy, which is where I want to head to very much next. So, Councillor Kilbane, you just stuck your hand up again, but you've had a few questions on this particular topic around decision making. Was it something burning on that particular topic, or are we okay to move us right? In which case, if we move us then into looking at, in particular, around page 4 and 5, the principles and the objectives of the strategy as a whole, and Councillor Pearson, you've neatly moved us into that section. So, officers, if you can answer that question, and then I'll invite questions from other members around that more broader sort of principles of the strategy, rather than the actual individual decision-making processes. So over to officers to answer Councillor Pearson's question. Okay,
I think you're asking me how we balance some of those really big policy objectives in our asset strategy, and it is a very hard challenge to try and because we don't have limitless funds to be able to achieve this. So in order for us to completely green our estate, it would take millions to achieve that. We don't have millions. Our ambition therefore is to look at those ones where we think they've got a long-term future and invest in greening those, and then dispose of some of those assets that are that they've gone end of life and don't have a particularly obvious future and would cost a great deal of money to green. That might be part of, right, we've got that building and it's a bit crumbling and it's never going to be green, so we knock that down and we sell that, or we knock that down and we use that to deliver housing, or we partner with another organisation to be able to green that. It could be that's a facility that would be great as a community facility. We don't have the capital to do anything with it, so we'll do a community asset transfer to an organisation that would then be able to get grant funding to deliver both the greening of it, the refurbishment, and secure a well-owned community use of the site. So I'm afraid there is no simple equation on this one about how it's done. And sometimes it is a careful balancing act, and sometimes it's you have to decide on one or the other. I think what we've tried to reflect in the change on the wording on this one is that the sustainability one can no longer be a, well, we might do it if we've got money. We've got to actually have an ambition to achieve that. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve our policy ambitions over the next 10 or 20 years. Therefore, the consideration of the suitability of our estate for retrofitting sustainability measures needs to be an important element of it. And I think we've got further work to do to be able to evaluate that element of our current asset condition.
Thank you, Tracy. Just while we mentioned the bit about carbon neutrality, and I think, you know, we'd all welcome the sort of making the wording more robust on that. My only thought I'd had was whether or not, and I appreciate completely the cost and the difficulties of this, but does it go far enough? Is carbon neutrality for our assets enough if we're trying to make the entire city carbon neutral by 2030? And actually, I know one of the big sort of selling points of the devolution thing is about carbon negative. So if we're thinking of the next 5 years of strategy for our asset management strategy, should we be looking at carbon negative rather than carbon neutral? And what were your thoughts around that?
I think that the carbon negative versus neutral argument has got to be on the acceptance that there are going to be some elements of the carbon roadmap that are impossible to neutralize. So if you've got a heritage building, it's incredibly difficult to make that carbon neutral. So you have to accept that there's an offset going on, and that you'll try and achieve carbon negative to be able to offset the fact that you've got some assets which are bound are going to be almost impossible to deal with. So for instance, we own 70% of the Shambles. That's going to be a hell of a target to try and turn that into a passive house development. It isn't. It is always going to have some a carbon footprint. We therefore need to work on the rest of our estate to try and up our game, so we get as near to carbon negative as we can, or in some cases to be carbon negative. So for instance, on the housing delivery programme, the fact that we will have passive house doesn't take you to carbon negative, but if you then start to generate green energy there, it does. The fact that you put PVs wherever you can put them, on car parks or on eco centres, contribute to the kind of green energy element of it. But this is just one element of a broader strategy around sustainability and carbon reduction. We've got to do our bit, but we can't within this strategy deliver the fact that the rest of the city's also got to be addressed.
No, I appreciate that, and that's helpful. Neil, I think you were wanting to add something as well.
Just again to emphasise how important it is that members obviously set policy, but also understand how far-reaching policy then is in the thinking of officers. So the fact that this policy change effectively requires us to consider carbon neutrality by 2030 will mean that assets such as the Harewood Wind landfill site and the opportunities to photovoltaics on the side of that will effectively increase the of officers and reports to come forward to achieve that objective. And again, when we're looking at opportunities, that, as Tracy's indicated earlier, opportunities arise or sometimes at very short notice. If there's an opportunity, carbon negative investment to come forward, this change in policy will impact on our response to that and the ability for the council to respond to that. So it does, the policy framework is really very important, and it will influence the opportunities coming to us, because the market will read this and say, I've got an opportunity, but it will also influence the likelihood of projects coming forward to achieve those objectives.
That's helpful. Thank you, Neil. Just Neil, I don't know if anybody else is having this, but your internet connection is just being a little bit glitchy. So it's fine, but if it gets any worse, I'll perhaps just ask you to turn your video feed off. But I'll say it's all right for the minute. I've just got another question on this section, and I can see Councillor Kilbane's hand's just gone up as well on this section. So I just wanted to invite anybody else with any questions on these particular bits of principles and objectives before I then move us on to looking at some of the individual cases. So the one that I just wanted to ask you really was in paragraph 8 in the report, it says that we've been designated a one public estate authority for 5 years, which has attracted some additional funding and is about supporting a national programme of work. And what I just, with the exception of a couple of specific examples within the strategy and in particular thinking about this purchase that we'll probably be discussing of the I forgot what it's called now. This kind of small business hub on Amy Johnson Way. But the first line of the strategy, which is about creating economic growth, and it's homes and jobs. And I think there's quite a lot of stuff around homes, but maybe not so much stuff around the job creation side of things. And I just wondered if you could talk to that in terms of the principles and the objectives within this asset management strategy, and what we're doing about trying to create economic growth specifically around jobs with this strategy.
So all of the work that we're doing on York Central is part of the use of our assets to lever some influence on a larger scheme. So I'd say that the biggest economic regeneration scheme the city has known since the Romans has been started off with our assets, even though we don't own very much land. The fact that we were a landowner gave us a much bigger role in being able to influence it. The development of the Guildhall, another key asset for us. The development of West offices, it's not just us in there. There's other business activity which feeds the city centre. Our investment in our commercial portfolio, where we have offices, retail, light industrial spaces in there. That's all about economic development. And it's in the decisions that are in this particular report at the moment. There are a few that are about economic development, but what's not being decided upon in here, but is actually underpinning most of our strategy, are those absolute big ticket things which are dominating the terrain around economic development, creating the space for businesses to grow in the city, and working with partners to do the same.
I appreciate what you're saying. I guess it's just looking at the principles as set out, the sort of A to K and the kind of 3 or 4 key objectives, and it's just, I don't know, I'm not seeing the jobs side of it being as far to the front of this as I would expect, given that it's the first of those 4 recommendations or those 4 objectives from the national thing. And I don't know whether a lot of local authorities are designated as one public estate authorities, and therefore it's just a general kind of national thing, or if this sort of makes us an exemplar authority, or a bit more of a unique one. I may just have expected to see that set out. I hear what you're saying in terms of what you're telling us about how you're applying it, but it doesn't seem to be reflected in the wording of the principles in the way I might have expected.
It's in there at point F that we will acquire or hold assets to drive economic development or regenerate an underperforming part of the city. We could put it at A or B or C, but it's above housing in terms of where it rates in if you take that in priority order, which it's not. The one public estate, we were a very early adopter. We were one of the first authorities to get on the bus, and we benefited significantly from some early Kickstarter funding regeneration work on York Central and Castle Gateway. Those were two of the ones, and on West offices that were part of that. That scheme is now been joined by most authorities within Britain, so we are continue to work with them. Their priorities have shifted over the course of our engagement with them, and they are slightly more focused now on housing than they used to be. But the priority of economic development, I think, is quite clear in our strategy. Perfectly willing to take that forward to executive as a recommendation that it becomes A, not F. But
well, I don't think it's about where it comes in the ranking order, but I think there is a difference between trying to drive economic growth generally across the city versus highlighting underperforming parts of the city. And I absolutely would. It's not a criticism of point F. I think point F is very valid, that we do need to be looking at regeneration and growth in underperforming parts of the city, but it's also sort of looking at the economy as a whole in the city, and how can we use our asset management strategy to push that. And I didn't get a sense that was reflected as strongly as I might have expected within these principles. Neil, you just took your hand up to comment as well.
Yeah, just to reflect, the York economy is, from recollection, Tracy will put me right here, it's 1 billion plus in scale. So the actual assets that we own as a council are relatively small. So in terms of having a big impact on the economic future of the city, I think you're right. But what we do in terms of direct ownership, but what we do, and I think Tracy's exemplified this with in terms of the York Central model, is that we try to encourage others to invest, and that's where we've got the investment of Holland and Barrett on Coney Street. Our investment in there has encouraged quite significant investment by private sector partners. So it might not be direct investment that sees that those outcomes that you're talking about, but it's us as a catalyst for others that I think is sometimes not necessarily overt, and maybe we should make more overt nature of that in the report.
Yeah, and I think we include those aspirations within our economic strategy, which is also out to consultation at the moment, and our regeneration approach. So I would be happy to reword that point F. But I think it does reflect the fact that when we're using our assets, we're tending to be more interventionist in a market that's failing. If it's all flying out the door and everything's working fine and economic development is working, then that's not the areas where we're generally spending our time. We are buying the asset on Coney Street to be able to address the problems that Coney Street has got now and is going to have in the future. We're not getting involved in areas where it's all going well. So I think that just reflects that fact that we intervene where we see that the market might need help.
No, and I appreciate that, and as I say, it's not suggesting that I don't think that that's, you know, a very important part of what we can do, and I fully see, which I think is what you're both saying, that, you know, the role of the council as a kind of a facilitator and an instigator, you know, within that, and I think that is very much where we need to be. I suppose just rolling us back to some of that thing about decision making and how that part of the process works, just because you've both mentioned, you know, the fact that we're a landowner on York Central as being part of the way that we might influence and leverage some of what goes on there. And of course, it was only a couple of years ago that we were at a decision session, an executive decision session, proposing to sell off our 5% of land holdings. And I think it was only Callum Taylor as the local ward councillor speaking and intervening that caused the executive to defer a decision that night to dispose of that asset. We you know, it was almost right on the edge. And, you know, I think that's where we're talking about wanting to have that influence of you know, both the combination of local ward councillors, but also, you know, being clear about how the policy's transferring through into practice in terms of what decisions are being taken and why. Because, as I say, 2 years ago, had Callum not registered to speak that night and not been sufficiently influential, we may not have that leverage that we're now saying is so important.
Can I pick up on that one before
you may both do, yeah. I thought you may wish to.
I mean, it's an interesting one. There's no, you know, there's no absolutely right way to do these things. We had even less land ownership on York Central at the very beginning of it, and we had 5 acres over on Holgate Road that we used to lever our way into the partnership. We then acquired the Fermatol industrial estate to be able to secure that at a point when nobody else had the wherewithal to purchase it, so that it was within the ownership of the partnership. We went to start acquiring Unipart to achieve the same objective, to bring third-party land ownership into the hands of the partners so that we could deliver the entire scheme. Then you roll through and you decide how is that site going to get developed out. And members decided on the Fermatol industrial estate that they did not wish to dispose at that point. And now we've got another decision to make, which is how are we going to develop it out then when it's such a small and inaccessible piece of land? So we've got to work back with the partners in a different way. So we'll take those challenges out as they are. But that wasn't about us selling off land that we owned in the first place. We deliberately, strategically acquired it so that we had influence and could flow through into York Central. But if you want to add anything to that now.
Yeah, just reflecting really. I think there's, as you say, hindsight's not necessarily a perfect thing. Well, sorry, is a perfect thing, but we're not there yet as to understand how York Central fully develops out in terms of the major landowners, although we've obviously got a huge amount of influence on that as an authority through the outline planning application. I think there is an argument about that 5% having an ongoing influence, but I think the point that Tracy's made well is that a significant amount of that influence was exerted at the time that we made those purchases, and indeed the investment that prompted from Homes England. So their purchase of the Unipart site, the willingness of Network Rail to move off the site onto the land that we'd sold them on Holgate, the opportunity that we took to purchase the land on Holgate that would have been the access back in 2014. All of those things are moving parts, and we play our role of influence we can at a particular point in time. And I think that again goes back to Tracy's point that she made earlier, that it really is a moving feast, and it all is about that, the decisions, making the best possible decisions you can at a particular point in time. They are absolutely judgment calls, and you are absolutely right, Councillor Crawshaw, to point out it was members that made that decision, rightly so. It's members that have to make the judgment calls. Ultimately, we can provide the advice as officers. Members then make those judgment calls, and they will be judged thereafter as to whether that was the right call or not. And we'll wait and see what happens with York Central. But I think at this moment in time, it's looking really quite exciting a prospect that we can work with partners to develop that site out. As Tracy says, our own land holdings are probably not developable out in a coherent way. We will need to work with partners to do that.
Thank you. So Councillor Kilbane, I see your hand up on this section. I'd like to then move us on to looking at some of the sort of more individual cases. So Councillor Kilbane, if you want to just ask your question quickly.
I think my question might segue nicely between the two, and I will resist the temptation to jump into York Central until we get to that part of the report. Although I am enjoying your Norman Collier impersonation, Neil. It's very good. I think you might be a bit too carbon neutral. Your Wi-Fi needs a bit of a boost. Mind you, mine packed in the other day as well. Just in terms of the asset sort of strategy, might it be worth putting in or raising with the exec or trying to get something in place about trying to deal with the fact that we seem to have so many assets that are on our hands for so long doing nothing, one way or another. So might it be worth putting something in there that means that we're more streamlined in the way that we make our decisions about these things? And that I'm not pointing that finger at anybody, members or officers or anybody, but just in general, could we have a better way of dealing with the portfolio, because we do have a number of assets here that have been sat in our hands doing nothing for quite a while.
Yeah, and this report is partly to address some of those ones where it's just been outstanding. We were intending to bring this report in February, got interrupted by a major global pandemic. It's slightly ironic to be berated for not disposing of assets, because it's actually quite difficult to get members to decide upon them because of all of the complexity we've just talked about. You do have to wait for the point in time when that's the right decision to make, and sometimes it is right to hang on because the opportunities haven't yet arisen. It's when the opportunities arise and you can make the best of both worlds that you bring forward these decisions. But if you've got no useful use for an asset, but there might be something that comes on around the corner, it's also worth just remembering that sometimes the decisions take good decisions with benefits of both a community and a financial outcomes. Sometimes you have to be a bit more patient to let them come through. So I'm thinking particularly something like Ashbank, where we decided to dispose of it quite a long time ago, and we tried to do work to it to make it worth more, so we generated more value from it. And then there was a bid to purchase it by the adjoining landowner for an extension to the older person's accommodation program there. That required to go through planning. That took quite a long time. They then need to put the finance in place, and it just took from the outside it looked like a ridiculous amount of time, but that was because we had to wait for the stars to align to get all that thing across the line. We could quite easily have just gone to the market and gone highest bidder, off you go, and it would have gone. But sometimes that does not work, and we've had similar examples in York where the need to consider it being subject to planning gives a similar result. So I absolutely take on board your point that we need to stop hanging around on some of these things and get them shifted and get them moved, which is part of why this report is in front of you. But there are others where we still need to be patient.
Councillor Kilbane, I think you're indicating a supplementary question.
Sure, I just wanted to put Tracy's mind at rest that I'm not berating her, and it's not just
In
about
a
disposal.
gentlest, kindest of ways.
It's not just about disposal either. It's about decision-making process, isn't it? And I think it might be worth flagging that up in the report to the exec that maybe this is something we should be looking at, because it's frustrating for everybody, isn't it? Into the outside world, it does look ridiculous sometimes, doesn't it? So I just think that might be worth including for them to consider.
Just to be clear, consider what?
Developing a strategy that means we make decisions in this in a more streamlined way. You know, it's been a continuing problem in York. I mean, I think we'll all put our hands up to that. You know, over different political groupings running the city, it's been an ongoing problem for quite a long time. I think it's time we had a look at it and see if there's anything we could do better.
Councillor Fenton, had you indicated? Yep.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would disagree with kind of streamlining. I think sort of transparency is equally important. So if if an asset is idle, then you know, as long as we're assured that, you know, in line with the principle set out here, there may be a valid reason why quick disposal perhaps wouldn't contribute towards achieving some of the goals in terms of using assets to maximise outcomes for communities. As some of the examples we've heard, there's been, albeit sort of looking backwards, a valid reason why things didn't happen more quickly. I think we'd all agree that we want to see things happen as quickly as they can, but I think as long as we've got that kind of assurance and that transparency that, you know, that there's a reason for that. But I think that, you're right, that's where some of the frustration comes in terms of going past a building every day thinking, what's happening? So there maybe is something, I don't know if streamline is the right word, but certainly in terms of being as transparent as we can in a world of sort of commercial sensitivity, etc. But and hopefully the revised strategy and the fact that we're talking about it and there's an awareness about it, I think can only be a good thing in terms of, you know, improving all of our knowledge and understanding.
I think that transparency is really important because there are a number of assets where we've not brought decisions on them because there's something holding over, there's something unresolved that means we can't actually make a decision. And maybe Scrutiny would like to have a greater look at those ones so it's better understood as to why they are holding over.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is move us on to looking at some of the individual cases. That first whole discussion there, I think, has been really, really useful. Certainly, I've found it very interesting, but it's taken longer than I was anticipating it might do. So having said that, I didn't want to take an adjournment and try to push on through. I think actually it would be prudent to just have a quick 5-minute adjournment now and then come back. I would suggest if we can come back at 7:05, so it is just a very quick one. And then if anybody has questions about any of the individual aspects of the strategy and some of the individual cases, we'll go through those and we'll look to ensure that we're finished by 8 o'clock at the absolute latest, but hopefully a little bit earlier than that if we can. So if you could just switch off your video screens and mute yourselves, and we'll come back at 5 past. Right, welcome back everybody to this evening's meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee, where we are discussing the update on the asset management strategy. So I'm now inviting members to ask questions on any of the specific elements of the strategy. There's quite a number of specific cases within the document, so if members would like to indicate now if they want to raise any questions, and I see Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question for Tracy, I think, about the Guildhall project. I'm sure there is active risk management in terms of projects. I just wondered to what extent the proposed arrangements for the office space sort of de-risks the project from the council's perspective, and how that might impact on the sort of broader development of the site. Thank you. You're on mute,
pause, Tracy.
I'm not even going to say anything about it. It's just that the factor of 2020, isn't it? How many times can you do that in a year? The risk registers for the Guildhall contain the risks that we may not be able to immediately let the restaurant, and they also contain the risk that the office space doesn't generate the sufficient revenue to meet the requirements of the business case. And just to remind you, the previous executive decision, having soft market tested the operation of the office to the market, hadn't given us an offer that would meet those financial requirements, and therefore we decided that we would operate it and take all of the kind of operator profit, and with it the risk that we ourselves didn't generate the amount of revenue from the office function. This deal massively underpins the business case. It delivers us a guaranteed revenue at a level we expect in the business case. It doesn't require us to take the risks of staffing up to be able to operate it and then being able to take individual leases from businesses. We've got one occupier in there simply delivering all of the financial outcomes that we aspire to. So I think it is a very big resolution of that particular risk. Risk still exists on the restaurant, but the business centre side of it is covered.
Thank you. Councillor Kilbane, I think there was a supplementary there.
Is it still the intention to have full council back in there?
Yes, the arrangement with the York Science Park provides for the council to have use of the complex for full council meetings and for a series of civic events in the Guildhall itself, so mayor making, that kind of thing. And we've worked with Democratic Services to secure the required level of usage that we anticipated would happen, even if we were running it ourselves.
Thank you. And I'm looking for other questions, but Councillor Kilbane has got his hand up, and I'm conscious that it's been a bit of a Pete and Johnny show, hasn't it, this evening? But I'm just looking for other members if they want to come in ahead of us, and you know, I'm sure there'll be a few questions. So Councillor Musson.
Thanks. I was waiting for the people to speak, but I realised that there is no other people apart from you two, so I'll give them a break. So I wanted to ask a question about Oakhaven, because we talked a lot about scrutiny and transparency, and I understand that Oakhaven was previously discussed by Health Scrutiny, and that it was agreed that an appraisal or some sort of report around all the options of the outcome of that would come to a future meeting to be discussed before any decision was made. I guess it was an indication they might do some pre-decision scrutiny. I understand, obviously, there are significant reasons why that might not have happened, obviously coronavirus being the main one, but has there been any informal meetings of that committee since that have spoke to that issue at all? Because I think, unless it's like incredibly time sensitive, it's quite, given that it was sort of promised to them that we're going to talk about it before a decision happened. If it's now coming to exec on Thursday and they still haven't appraised those options, it doesn't really speak to the kind of scrutiny and transparency that we've just talked about in the strategy.
I have to say I was not aware that that scrutiny committee had arrived at that determination. It's the first I've heard of it. So no, I don't think it has been discussed with them.
Is that something, Dawn, you could comment on as well?
I mean, I can only echo Tracy's sentiments actually, because it's the first I've heard of it. But then, as you all know, we had the retirement of the scrutiny officer who was assigned to health scrutiny specifically, just as we kind of went into COVID. So it may just have been a slip in terms of relaying that information back to Tracy's team. I don't know. I'd have to check, Councillor. I'd have to check the decisions of health to corroborate it.
Is
As
that
far as
something that...
I am aware, it was sort of something that Sharon Holden had said and Vicky Jake had mentioned it. So it might be that that side of it was sort of aware of it, but perhaps the asset management team weren't.
That sounds likely by the sound of it.
Right.
I'm certainly the informal meetings that I sat through during the summer of health, they certainly hadn't looked at it. And if Tracy's unaware of it, it's a fair indicator in itself, I would suggest.
Councillor Kilbane, I'll bring you in, and then Neil, I can see you're wanting to come in as well. So Councillor Kilbane.
Hi, thanks, Jay. Yeah, I used to sit on health scrutiny, and it was definitely on its programme of work, and I think it was due to come to March scrutiny that got postponed. But obviously, Councillor Doughty will be able to give you the full picture, and I would certainly echo Councillor Musson's comments and suggest that scrutiny should have its role before any decision is made, and because I think they were looking not just at Oakham but the overall picture in York. So I think that process should be gone through before the decision's made.
I mean, the point not saying one way or another whether that's appropriate for them to look at it, but any vacant assets for CYC become vacant assets. They're not owned by a service once they've been vacated. They are a corporate asset, and therefore they are in the purview of our corporate scrutiny management committee, and it is your responsibility to oversee the decisions that are made. Otherwise, every decision on an asset, far from it being streamlined, would run around every scrutiny committee. And have every ward councillor inputting into it. We've got to have a single point where we can overview these things. I
would just echo that, Johnny. Just from a corporate point of view, that this committee would be the platform for those sorts of considerations going through in terms of scrutiny. So I was somewhat surprised to hear it, but clearly a corporate director has indicated that perhaps for information, that they should look at it. So we'd have to go through the background a little bit to find out a little bit more.
Sure. Neil, did you want to add something else?
Yeah, just
to you as well, Councillor Fenton. Sorry.
Obviously, there's been a miscommunication here, but I just reflect on the paragraph 57 in the report that effectively the older person accommodation team have carried out a soft market review, and if they've come to the conclusion that the site is vacant. So it's not that our teams have effectively not collaborated with other officers on the older person's accommodation in respect of bringing this sale forward. So that team are fully aware of the proposal in front of CSMC tonight and executive on Thursday. So it's just that there has been undertaken by that team. I just thought it worthwhile pointing that out, and to reiterate again the point that Dawn and Tracy's made is it is in the purview of this committee and executive for the sale, not specifically in the purview of the social care team for the disposal of this asset.
I'm just reviewing the minutes of that meeting, and it was agreed that the committee would receive an update on Oakhaven at their next committee meeting in March, not to undertake a review.
Okay, Councillor Fenton, you wanted to add something, and Councillor Kilbane, I see you just indicated then as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, from a housing scrutiny perspective, we have received, Councillor Musson will recall as well, a couple of meetings. We've had discussions on the older persons accommodation programme. I suppose it's a useful reminder that when we have those conversations, we as members and as a committee, need to be mindful if there are sort of asset issues that we should pick them up and discuss them in that forum. So I think Scrutiny has the opportunity and does take the opportunity to have those discussions with officers. But it's a useful reminder for us that we shouldn't overlook the asset element of the delivery aspects of those programs.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. Councillor Kilbane.
I'd support what Councillor Fenton's saying. I'm hearing some very defensive words here now from officers. It's perfectly within the purview of the Scrutiny Committee to want to take all of the assets that deliver health and social care into account when they're looking at a review of health and social care across the piece. And obviously, as you know, it was on the programme of work, and that meeting that was due to be held in March was obviously put off, wasn't it? So I do suggest you pick this up with Councillor Doughty.
Councillor Musson.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think what was agreed wasn't simply that they would give an update, but that they would put the sort of findings or recommendations sort of to health scrutiny as a precursor, and that they would listen to their thoughts on the subject, not just give them an update, but to actually take those opinions forward before they put it to exec. And on the work plan, it might not be minuted on the exact one that Tracy's looking at, but it is at points referred to as an options appraisal. So that's their understanding of what was going to come to them. Whether or not it's obviously not happened, but that's what they thought was going to happen before any decision was taken by executive.
So I guess that one of the things that we always say at the start of a meeting is to remind everybody that the meeting is webcast and recorded for posterity. So the wonder of technology does allow us to go back and look at exactly what was expected by that committee. I appreciate that time is incredibly tight now, so we perhaps need to pick that up tomorrow, just to double check that there's nothing that should have happened that hasn't happened. The point I guess I would just make from a scrutiny perspective and understanding entirely what people are saying about this committee's role within this particular strategy. I think what this committee would seek to do, certainly under the new way of operating, is looking to ask the members with more expertise on particular committees to look at a specific asset or a specific area, and then give us some information back to help us inform our decision. I may have a slightly rosy view of how that process could work, but there's no reason for that not to be a relatively nimble process in terms of us commissioning, say, for example, health scrutiny to do that appraisal, to then feed it back to us, to help us feed in from our perspective from a CSMC. But I do appreciate that it is Monday and this is a decision for Thursday, so we may need to think about whether or not that was appropriate on this particular issue at this particular time. But I am sort of starting to think whether or not there might be something within the strategies about, we talked earlier about streamlining decision-making processes and how people are involved in the decision-making processes, and perhaps something a little more around that might be something for this committee to look at in the longer term. Neil, I see you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, just a really question for Janie and Dawn, really, because officers can't undertakings of a meeting from a webcast and effectively surmise what that committee does and doesn't want. It is a matter of the minutes and the resolutions of that committee that the officers who effectively act upon. It's just to confirm that is the position, and therefore if it doesn't appear in the minutes, it's a matter for the committee, when it ratifies those minutes, to make the appropriate amendments. Otherwise, if we start to review every webcast and say, oh, actually exec member said this at this point, or such and such said this, how do we guess as to the resolutions of committees? It should be reflected in the minutes, is my understanding. Is that right, Janie?
Yes, if the minutes have been ratified at the following meeting, effectively signed off, then they are classed as the accurate record of the decisions that were taken at that meeting. So it would be hard to go behind that once they've been signed off by the committee.
I think if we get into a discussion about minutes, and in particular with Health Scrutiny Committee, there's quite a lot of history to the minutes with that committee in particular. But I absolutely take your point, Neil, that if we're not clear about where a referral or a recommendation or a request has gone, then it's difficult if the lines of communication are not making that clear. I think the reason why I was suggesting that we might want to look back on this particular issue is because if this is something that was just around the time when all of the scrutiny committees were suspended, and notwithstanding that this whole asset management strategy was also delayed at around about the same time, I'm just wondering whether something that under the normal processes might have happened has not happened because of everything else that was going on in the world in February and March time. So it's just, as I say, it wouldn't be a normal matter, of course, that I'd be suggesting that we all go back and look at something that happened 9 months ago to get the nuances of a wording, but that was more my thinking.
All I would suggest, Councillor Crawshaw, if you're comfortable, is we review the minute, because I think that's the matter, not the actual meeting itself. So if the minute is read out by Tracy's reflective of the decision of the meeting, then it's a further report would be brought back on Oakhaven, not a in-depth analysis. So it's just like saying.
Can I suggest we pick this up in perhaps tomorrow morning?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because I think that the problem, the other side to that is that if it was on the work plan for March, expecting an options appraisal, and I haven't seen either the minute or the work plan, so I don't know what the wording is, and we're speculating. So I think if we pick that up in the morning, perhaps have a conversation with Councillor Doughty as well, in terms of what his understanding as chair was, and as I say, I would caveat all of that with being very conscious that this is a published paper coming to executive on Thursday for a decision, so that there may be a timing issue, even if there wasn't an issue of will within it. Councillor Musson, I see your hand up. I don't know if it was another comment on this that you wanted to make.
It's a related but separate comment. You'll be pleased to know it's not about minutes.
Sure.
It's a question about Oakhaven. Part of the report, pages 17 to 18, talks about the proposal and the offer for the site. And then in the bullet point that's numbered 63, it says that if it's not achieved within 12 weeks of agreeing heads of terms, the property will be placed upon the open market for disposal. Now, is that completely open, no agreement that it's going to be a care facility of any kind, as in just a straight sale?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's just what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm looking for any other hands, and I'm not seeing hands at the moment. I think some committee members may be relieved to know, as may officers. But I've just got a couple of questions that I wanted to ask on a couple of specific points just within the papers. One, which I hope will just be quite a quick one. Paragraph 121 on page 30, which is, we've already discussed the herdsman cottages, but it was just in point A, where it says the net income that could be achieved from a holiday let would be in the region of £5,000 per annum. And I just wanted to double check that wasn't a typo, because that seemed incredibly low. That
is the net profit on that scheme, because you've got to pay off the cost of refurbishing it.
Yeah, no, I understood that even in that context. So the net profit, when by the time you'd refurbish the thing, and over presumably a period of, was it 10 to 15 years, that you would be paying that back, and so you'd be looking at a 5k per annum.
Nick's your man on this one.
I am. I was going to. Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, they are small properties, and there are costs associated with refurbishing them. My team have spoken to holiday letting agents as part of the process, and so yeah, those are the finances that we've looked at, and hence that particular route was dismissed in our kind of analysis of the particular options.
The other thing to consider in terms of the holiday let issue is exactly how you do it within the powers open to a local authority. It'd be very difficult to justify that the holiday let was not a commercial operation, therefore would need to be delivered within a company structure rather than as the council. And I think we've been around that loop before. Roundtree Lodge.
Well, that was
Roundtree
what I'd
Park
got in
Lodge being
mind,
the one.
and the numbers being quite different. That was what made it jump out at me.
Yeah, it's a much smaller property with less commercial value.
Thank you. The other, I just wanted to make a sort of a positive point about the Riverside Path and what's going on there. And I know I did have a very brief conversation with, again, mentioning Callum Taylor again, because I know this is something that he's done a lot of pushing on within that. But I think, you know, that looks broadly something that I think everybody would welcome within that. The other thing that I just wanted to raise and sort of ask a question around really was around the use of West Offices and Hazel Court, which we've touched on a little bit already. And I appreciate in some respects this maybe is a slightly unfair question for you all from an asset management perspective. But we did discuss it with Trudy Forster, I think it was last week or the week before, from an HR perspective. And it was just to seek a reassurance again that when we're considering the use of buildings, and I note that a lot of people have really enjoyed working from home, and it's been a really positive thing for a lot of people. But what I wouldn't want to find is that officers are put under any pressure to work from home because we're seeking to generate a particular amount of revenue from our assets within our buildings. So I guess I wanted just a little bit of reassurance on that, and then perhaps just a request that as that report starts to look as though it's coming ready, I think that's maybe something that either this committee or Economy in Place might be worth us just looking at in terms of the use of our council buildings for our own purposes, as it were.
Certainly happy to support that recommendation, Chair. In terms of the joys or otherwise of home working, I think we've all been through that journey where you start out thinking, oh, this isn't so bad really, and then after a while it gets a bit tiresome. The trip down the stairs to your office becomes less and less attractive. There are definitely upsides to it. Nobody's going to, however, pretend that it is a nirvana situation to be working from home 5 days a week. It has got its other challenges, and those are more acute for some people than they are for others, depending on what your home situation is, or your personality is, or what your kind of mental health situation is. We would not want to underestimate the importance of the social aspects and the creative aspects of actually being in the presence of other human beings during the course of the working week. And the review will of course be mindful primarily of the needs of the City of York Council for its office space, and that means the health and well-being of its staff.
That's really encouraging to hear, and you know, to have an office as I'm sat at my kitchen table, and you may or may not have heard my partner cooking in the background a few minutes ago, and it's one of the yes, more interesting aspects of home working and sharing meetings from home. Councillor Kilbane, I see your hand is up again.
That was a fairly loaded again there, Chair, if you don't mind me saying. Just looking at the affordable housing aspect of this, just to clear it in my head, when we're looking at I know we do more affordable housing when it's council development, so we'll go up to 40% affordable housing on a site. Is affordable housing still 80% of market rates? And if it is still 80% of market rates, is that realistically affordable for most normal working people in York? Should we be looking at changing that?
Sorry, the definitions of affordable housing you'll be familiar with. The 40% mix in York is 20% social rented. So you've got the same rate as the rest of our council housing. The other 20% is can flex depending on which of the schemes it is as to whether or not that is 80% of market rate or whether it is shared ownership. So that is dependent on each scheme and the way in which the metrics work on that. In terms of changing council policy on the percentage of affordable housing within the housing delivery programme, I don't think that's a CSMC issue. I think you've got to go to the Housing and Safe Communities Scrutiny Board for that particular discussion.
Thank you. So I'm looking around for, I say the words and the hands go up. Councillor Musson.
Sorry, I always wait for you to do that because I don't want to talk too much, but seeing as you were looking for people, I have gone back while we've been speaking and looked at some of the minutes of the previous health scrutiny meetings. And in the minutes of the January meeting of this year, it says, the chair took this opportunity to inform the committee that the older persons accommodation update report would now be considered at the 18th February meeting, and that the proposed options at Oakhaven would be considered at the 19th of March meeting. So, I mean, that's there in the minute that they're going to consider those options at the March meeting. I know we did have that conversation about the minutes being the letter of the law, as it were, and I think that's as close to an options appraisal.
Well, I think that was at that point. I think Oakhaven was still subject to this procurement that hadn't quite come to an end at that point. So that would be in terms of the discussion about what that procurement would give rise to. I think. Let us go back to Vicky on that one and kind of clarify where, if she was party to those conversations, then we will bring that back and have a conversation with Councillor Doughty.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor Musson. I think that's useful just to have that as well. And as I say, if we pick that up in the morning and we can see where that takes us to. Councillor Kilbane.
I'm willing to wait if any of my Lib Dem colleagues have got a question. No. Okay, just in terms of Willow House, I am intrigued because the report seems to imply that this is part of a larger scheme involving the adjacent estate. Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, so the council owns a significant proportion of the council housing that is immediately adjacent to the former older persons accommodation. It's not particularly well laid out. There are lots of spaces, but not a lot of green space. There's a lot of unused drying space and unused garage spaces. So the release of funding from the housing delivery programme is to look at the broad how Willow House could be redeveloped, but also to look at the surrounding area as to whether there's a kind of an estate regeneration that could be achieved in tandem with with the Willow House redevelopment.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Fenton.
Just following on from that, 'cause my reading of the estate, I read that to be the land surrounding Willow House. I hadn't read it in the context of the wider Warmgate estate. So that's helpful to understand that it's not the ambition isn't simply Willow House and the land surrounding it within the footprint of the site, but potentially sort of looking at the broader sort of Warmgate housing and seeing what can be done. Just mindful of sort of thinking back to the discussions around the time of the previous plan, that I think one of the issues at play was the informal green space near to the walls, and that was, I know, one of the concerns that people had at that time about the plan that was in train then, but has since is no longer there. So no, thanks for that clarification.
This is one of those ones where, because we are retaining the asset, we can look at a slightly different development footprint and hopefully come back with something that is a better result for the overall area in terms of placemaking, rather than just a tight red line development where it's expected that it fits in on the current footprint of the existing building, which was what was troubling the people who were trying to buy it last time. Is it just did not work out, and therefore we've got to look at it in a slightly different way to make the best of the space and make the best impact on the existing housing stock that we've got in the area.
Thank you for that, Tracy. Councillor Kilbane.
Thanks, Chair. Just on paragraph 114 to do with well, it's to do with 29 Castlegate, but it's the point towards the end that I'm interested in. And obviously, there are a lot of non-commercial organisations need space in the city, and by the looks of this, they've been asking if they can use 29 Castlegate. Towards the end, it says that there will be opportunities to find space elsewhere. it just seems a bit vague. Have you got properties in mind that non-commercial organisations could use? Because obviously they also work for the good of the city, and also whether or not we're looking at meanwhile use of buildings.
In terms of the council, I'm starting going backwards. Meanwhile use on the council buildings, we have very few vacant assets to have meanwhile uses in, yet we are always interested in those for any spaces or any locations where that we don't have an immediate use, but we don't want to dispose. Castlegate itself has got to be refurbished before it is occupiable. The expressions of interest that we have had around Castlegate, the business case for those has been unsupported by the service areas, or in terms of, well, the external, there's been no council requirement that's actually makes any sense and has got a financial budget to fund it. In terms of interest expressed by charitable bodies, there's been a significant downside to some of those in terms of the length expected for the occupation. It's not a pop-up use, it's a long-term use. And given the Castle Gateway project, where we need to be looking for the medium to long term about the future use of those spaces, the council wanted to have access to those in all but the short term, hence is focusing on commercial space utilisation. And in terms of other spaces likely to become available in the city, regrettably, we will have an increasing number of vacancies appearing in shops across the city, and we anticipate that we would be working with the charitable sector to identify pop-up spaces, meanwhile uses, and medium to long-term opportunities. But we don't have specific assets in mind when we say that at this point.
Just to add to Tracy's piece, Spark York is probably the most high profile meanwhile use we've got in the city at the moment. And that's an example of us using the estate.
Councillor Kilbane, was that supplementary on this point? Yeah.
It is, thanks. Just to raise a flag really for the non-commercial sector outside of charitable organisations. So there's an awful lot of creative people in the city that are constantly in need of space, and obviously add to the culture and well-being of the city that we should be considering for. So certainly for meanwhile use, I'm sure, you know, fleet of foot and flexible and all that kind of stuff, we could put our estate to a lot better use. And, you know, because personally, I hope that those spaces you're talking about don't become available. In the meantime, you know, where can we house some of our great creatives? Yeah,
and we're having that conversation with some of our creative partners in the city about some of the housing delivery sites, about how they might become part of that mix of you know, bring the vitality into, so it's not just residential, but there's other things going on. I think it's a really important mix that we look at live workspaces and how they relate to each other in a different way, because I think that the working world is evolving and evolving quite quickly at this point. So yes, always interested to talk, and Nick would be very happy to talk to anybody about renting out that space once we've actually done the works to refurbish it.
Thanks, Tracy. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, a slightly parochial issue, but I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about the good work that's going on with the Haxby Hall site and how that fits into the asset management strategy.
Yes, as part of the older, it's the final project in the older persons accommodation programme, and that is to transfer to a new provider in the new year. That again has been delayed by COVID, but that the ambition is to transfer that to a new provider in the new year. And they will then commence their redevelopment activities, keeping existing residents on site whilst they build a new part of the scheme, and then migrating over whilst they then refurbish the next bit. So that is finally starting to get away, and we hope to have activity on there in the new year. Our role in there with the additional assets has really been to facilitate a better layout of land and better access onto the site.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm not seeing any further hands. I've just got one further question, and then I think we'll start to look to wrap up the meeting. And it was just really about the former Askham Bar Park and Ride site, which I've never before seen as referred to as Moor Lane Car Park. And having grown up round there, I was I was looking at it thinking, where is that? And it was, oh, it's Askham Bar. But it seems from the 3 paragraphs here that it looks as though that there's no proposal for further work to develop a housing scheme, certainly from a council perspective on the site. And so would I be right to assume that that would then put that into the frame to potentially be sold off for realise the asset for it to be developed by somebody else, or what's the current thinking on that site? And I know it's currently being used as a flu vaccination drive-through, and may well be some other sort of drive-through vaccination centre, who knows.
So the proposal is not to take it out of the housing delivery programme at this point. It is still a 3rd phase site for that programme. It's not one that we're developing out at the moment, and that's partly because of its use as firstly a flu vaccination centre, and then hopefully a COVID vaccination centre, which would see it unavailable for decision making really for the next, who knows, 18 months, 2 years possibly. But we've also realised new opportunities for the housing delivery programme in Willow House and York Central, and those have been prioritised as being ones for development ahead of that, partly because it's not available. So we will revisit the future of the Moor Lane Car Park or Askham Bar Park and Ride as was, at a point when we see that we'll be getting it back into our ownership. And we will review it as part of the housing delivery programme, and we'll also review it for disposal, or see what other uses might have emerged at that point.
Thank you. I mean, I think what I had just got in my mind was thinking about the possibilities for some of the services and some of the things that side of the city perhaps is short of currently. And I know one of the sort of selling points of the proposed development around Askham Bog was potential to bring in some extra services that are much needed. It's certainly on the edge of Woodthorpe and what have you. And so I'm sort of thinking of Councillor Fenton here as one of the ward councillors, and shout out for my mum and dad who live in Dringhouses. But I know that there is that part of the city is in some ways in danger of just becoming only residential, and having a little bit more focus on some of the other services that communities do need. That might seem to be a potential site where some community engagement around what and how that site could be developed would be a good longer term prospect. And I see Councillor Fenton's jumped with his hand up. I don't know whether it was a comment you wanted to make on that.
No, they're all valid points, and I think with all of the sites within the housing development programme, I know that and I'm sure other councillors have engaged with officers in that programme to talk about our wish lists of things we think we might like to see on there, pointing out that the existing scout groups are at capacity in terms of space. Recognising the vision of partners such as Explore to have wherever possible co-located facilities, and sites of that nature don't come up too often. So it's really a case of, yes, our councillors, in all parts of the city, kind of engaging as early as possible with those discussions about any and all sites, and make sure you get your wish lists in early.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. Councillor Kilbane, your hand's gone up one more time, and it really will be one more time.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for your indulgence, Chair. And I'll sneak a couple of points into it then, which is, I mean, certainly in terms of the asset management, the overall city strategy, we should be thinking in terms of 15-minute city. So making sure everything that you need is within a 15-minute walk where you live. It seems to be the direction of travel. So I think that should certainly be informing thinking. But the last point that I wasn't going to make, but I've got to make it, I've just got this feeling that we shouldn't be getting rid of our investment in the science park. Surely in the long term that's going to pay us some dividends. It could be a golden ticket. I've had a look in the pink papers, and obviously I don't want you to refer to them, but I couldn't see anything to do with in terms of the return on investment, etc. in there. There might just be my site, but personally I'd like a bit more information on that, because surely it's the future, isn't it? More so than garlic bread. We need to keep investing in that in the science park, I would think.
We've owned those shares for a very long time, and we've never had a single penny back off them. So they are not a profit maker for the council. And I think the recommendation to executive is on the basis that our investment in the science park has leveraged sufficient economic benefit for the university now to be carrying that forwards, and we will use our economic impetus to move it to different areas of our own activity.
Watch the profits roll in when we sell.
Right, and on that note, I think I've just made a jot down of a few potential action points or recommendations as I see, and I know you know, Tracy had sort of made a couple of comments about things that you would look to include in any updates. The things that I'd noted was to look to refer a report on the future use of West Officers and Hazel Court to either this committee or Economy in Place as was appropriate. In due course. So if everybody, committee members, are happy to endorse that as a recommendation, if you could just shove your hand in the air so I can see that you're all broadly in support of that.
Sorry, can you just repeat?
Do you want me to repeat? Yeah. So it was just that we would seek to take a report on the future use of West Officers and Hazel Court, which is referred to in this paper as being due to be written up. That we'd look to take that to either this committee or Economy in Place, potentially as a pre-decision, but certainly to have some scrutiny input on that, whether it be through the forum or whether it be through a formal committee meeting.
And sorry. Do you have a timescale in mind, or to be guided by?
To be guided by officers. I'm going on what the report says, that there is a report to be written in due course, and so as and when that report's somewhere near being written, we either look at it through forum or we look at it through a pre-decision scrutiny committee. I'm seeing Neil nodding.
Not imminent at the moment, so yeah.
Yeah.
But we would be happy to accept that recommendation.
That's great. Councillor Pearson, did you just want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to add it to the work plan, so to speak.
Yeah, so what we would do is effectively we'll recommend that this is something that Scrutiny wants to look at. It'll go into that global work plan. We'll have a conversation about whether it's best sitting with the Economy in Place or this committee, and then see how the best way to progress that would be. So I'm taking that everybody's happy with that. Fab. The other point that I wanted to just see that committee perhaps might like to endorse is just to build on the conversation we had quite near the start of the meeting, which was just looking at maximising the ward councillors' ability to input in the decision-making process at the earliest possible stages, you know, as appropriate to do so. So again, I'm not looking for necessarily a formal form of words around that, but just the principle of saying that wherever we possibly can, if we can be engaging with ward members at the earliest possibilities. And I take the point that, Neil, I don't know if this is the point you're about to make, but also taking the point that ward councillors be proactive in trying to come to the Economy in Place team about the needs for their areas as well, so that it can be a bit of a dual relationship.
Yeah, I absolutely accept that. It's just whether or not you want to are you wanting to make a recommendation to executive for Thursday that ward councillors are consulted on disposals, or is it more general than that?
I think it's just a more general principle that I'd like to see conveyed. That would be my sense, and I don't know whether or not it's something that can just be amended to within the principles of the asset management strategy, that it's just a basic principle that wherever that's possible, we're seeking to engage at the earliest stage. If we need to do that in a more formal way, I'm happy to go in a more formal way, but as I say, it was just to get a sense of some of that conversation that we've had this evening, and just seeking to maybe just make it a little bit more proactive on both sides about engagement in this whole strategy.
It's just, again, so for me, obviously you've got a report going to executive on Thursday that effectively is a refresh of the policy. If this committee would like that to be in the policy so that effectively there is earlier engagement with ward members, then I think you should be making a formal recommendation. If it's loosely worded, then we've got no authority to effectively ask executive on Thursday to insert it into the policy, and officers can't just add bits to policy as they see fit.
Well, in which case, I'll happily propose that we do that on a formal recommendation. I'm just going to see if I can jot down a form of words that I can read out to you all very straightforwardly. So,
I'm happy to fill the dead air while you're doing that, Chair, if you like. It might be useful, you know, if ward councillors had a copy of the asset register for their wards. I know you can access them and work your way through it, but if you've ever gone into the document, it's a lot on it, and it takes some sifting. So if ward councillors could, you know, have easy access to that, that would be good.
So if we were to say that we would seek to engage ward members at the earliest opportunity to discuss the future use of assets within their ward.
When they become surplus to use, I would add Councillor Crawshaw.
Yeah.
Because obviously prior to that, they're schools and they're busy being used for whatever they're being used for.
Yeah. I'd be happy to accept that as an addition. Councillor Fenton?
I suppose just building on that wording, you could put elected members and local communities, and I know, you know, you go through often through the elected member to the community, but if you add communities as well, that would be.
So if we say seek to engage elected members and the community, that makes a different. That's slightly different, isn't it? Yeah.
Slightly moving away from Councillor Kilbane's objective of streamlining decision making.
Consulting ward members is one thing. To undertake an exercise of public consultation is a much bigger and more time-consuming piece, because we could get concerns that we haven't been consulted. So effectively, you're adding quite a lot of process and cost.
Okay,
whereas ward
so
members,
that's probably a sort of a later phase.
So should we take it as a given that the ward members we would expect to engage with their community, but it's about getting early sight on potential changes of use is I think the thrust of what we're saying.
That's fine.
So are we all happy with that as proposed wording? Councillor Kilbane, are you wanting to comment?
Yeah, no, totally. I just think it's making sure that the information is there in an open and accessible way, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's there. It's just, you know, takes a bit of sifting.
So can I just see everybody's hand as a show of support as a recommendation? All in favour? Fantastic. That's brilliant. We're going to pick up myself, Neil, Dawn. I think that maybe that'll be the starting point to just pick up this issue around Oakhaven. If we pick that up first thing in the morning, just to clarify what's been expected, what's going on, and if there's anything to do. But I think that requires a conversation rather than something that we can sort out this evening. And then the only other thing that I had wondered about, but I appreciate that this might be a bit more complicated as well, is just trying to pull together some of that we were talking about trying to streamline the process in terms of decision making and the sort of asset reuse or disposal and the input of scrutiny within that process as well, and whether or not we wanted to do anything further, because part of the review this evening, part of the recommendation was to look at the review of the asset management strategy. The other was to consider the process by which decisions are taken around reuse or disposal. And you know, obviously we did have quite a lot of discussion around that, and it's just whether or not we as a committee want to. Are we satisfied that we now know the process and that's all done, or there were some comments made around whether there were ways of further streamlining that process? Obviously, we've touched on it a little bit in terms of the principle of ward councillor engagement at the earliest stage, but did anybody want to do anything more formal with that aspect of the discussion that we've had this evening? Councillor Fenton, you got your hand in first, and then Councillor Kilbane.
I don't think so. I think we've talked about involvement of scrutiny. We've talked about involvement of elected members. So I'm, as has been kind of alluded to, I'm not quite sure what we meant by streamlining. Do we mean more quickly? Accepting that might not always be the best thing to do in terms of getting best outcome from a decision or an asset. So I'd probably be inclined not to take it to that level.
Okay, Councillor Kilbane, and then Tracy, I'll bring you in as well.
I will happily give way to Tracy first.
Sure.
Well, Councillor Eyre is not able to be at this meeting, and we have discussed with Councillor Eyre a regular report back on this was meant to kick off a series of quarterly reports on our asset strategy, which would give members the opportunity to be able to input and discuss those decisions as a regular thing. So this is not a kind of one-off. We then go back to how we've done it before. We still need to continue to look at this strategy in its entirety and to consider those decisions in the round. So I think if he were here, Councillor Eyre would wish us to propose that regular review process so that we can update on the decisions we've already made and then look at what is coming down the line, so we get a much more transparent and earlier view of the decisions that are emerging, and therefore can have a better engagement with both with ward councillors but also with scrutiny.
That's really helpful, Tracy. Was that a review that would come through his decision session?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
In that case, Chair, I will demur, and let's see how this new system works. Give it a go.
Great. Neil, do you want to comment?
Just to, again, just sound a bit of a pedant this evening, but if you agree with that and you want it to happen, then you make a recommendation.
You'd like us to recommend?
It's up to you.
Yeah.
I mean, like I say, but it just again it makes it clearer to the executive that you support that as a proposal.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's just a conversation you had.
Sure. So again, I'd be very happy to propose that as a formal recommendation that I'm just trying to think how I'm going to think on my feet of how we want to word this.
Support the proposal for a quarterly review of the asset strategy to the executive member for finance performance.
Yeah. So if we just do it as a formal, we are formally supporting that. So I'm not sure, Dawn, if you can just advise me in terms. Oh, has Dawn disappeared off the call? Janie.
Oh, I am. I'm here.
She's here. Apologies.
I'm really sorry because
I'm just wondering
I'm trying to multitask at the same time. So what I was going to suggest actually was come on just to say, if you want, I think that's absolutely fine as wording. If you wanted to pick anything up for specifically for scrutiny, however, you might need to incorporate and encourage the executive member to make any appropriate referrals to scrutiny for review, because otherwise that wording doesn't pick up that point, does it? It just merely commits a report to the executive member.
Well, so perhaps what we could do is support the quarterly review to the executive member and reaffirm scrutiny's commitment to support the executive member in any future decision making as he sees fit or requires, and then he can refer on to us if there's anything that he wants us to look at.
Really good.
Yeah. Can I just say, I'm not going to support him as he requires. I wouldn't be very happy with that wording. I can see some Lib Dems smiling, but I wouldn't be too happy with it.
What was it? What was the problem, Pete? As required.
I heard that we have to support the exec member as required. That's what I heard.
I think you know the gist of what we're trying to say. I take your point. So in terms of the specific wording then for a proposal, I think what we said was that we were supporting the decision to take a quarterly review of the asset management strategy to the executive member decision session, and we were reaffirming scrutiny's willingness to engage with the executive member on any future decision making.
That's very streamlined, Chair.
Yeah. So can I just see everybody's hand that we're happy to support that as a recommendation as well? That's everybody. That's great. Well, look, I think that that's, unless anybody has any other burning issues, I think that's all the business for this evening. So it just leaves me to thank the technical officers in the background for delivering the meeting, thank all the officers who've attended. It's been a really helpful and informative session. Did take a little longer than I was expecting, but I think it was worth doing because I think we got some really good stuff out. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll draw the meeting to a close here.
Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you.